I spent years saying yes to everyone around me. At work, at home, in relationships, until the day I finally noticed I had become someone they could no longer predict or control. The first time I realized I had been living someone else's life, it was over something as small as a tie. I was standing in front of the mirror in my apartment, adjusting a navy blue tie that my mother had picked out for me years ago. I hated that tie. It felt stiff and too bright for my taste. But I wore it anyway because she once told me it made me look serious. And serious, in my family, was always the goal. My name is Daniel Harper. I am 38 years old now. And for most of my life, I was the kind of man people described as reliable, easygoing, cooperative, the one who did not rock the boat. Looking back, that description was not a compliment. It was a warning sign. I grew up in a house where conflict was something you avoided at all costs. My father, Richard, was a quiet man who believed that stability came from keeping everyone comfortable. My mother, Linda, had strong opinions about what a good life looked like, and she was not shy about steering me toward it. When I was 18, I wanted to study architecture. I used to sketch buildings in the margins of my notebooks. I loved the idea of shaping spaces people would live their lives in. But one night at dinner, my mother gently suggested business school instead. She said architecture was unpredictable, risky. Business was stable, safe. My father nodded in agreement. He said, "You are good with numbers, Danny. It makes sense." I remember feeling that flicker of resistance in my chest, a small voice saying, "This is not what you want." But then I pictured the disappointment on their faces if I argued. I imagined the tension at the table, the subtle shift in the air. So I said yes. I told myself it was maturity, compromise, being practical. The same pattern followed me into my 20s. When my first real job offered me extra responsibilities without extra pay, I accepted them without hesitation. My manager, Paul Simmons, used to clap me on the back and call me a team player. Every time he asked me to stay late, I stayed. Every time he shifted part of someone else's workload onto my desk, I absorbed it. I convinced myself I was building a reputation. At home, it was no different. My younger sister, Emily, had always been more outspoken. If she did not want to attend a family gathering, she would say so. I admired that about her, but I never copied it. When my parents insisted I come home every other weekend, even when my schedule was packed, I went. When they offered advice about my finances, my apartment, my clothes, I listened, even when I disagreed. In relationships, I was the same man. My first serious girlfriend, Claire, liked Italian food. I preferred Mexican. We ate Italian almost every time. She liked living close to her office. I moved across the city so her commute would be easier. When she said she needed more space, I gave it. When she said I was too quiet, I tried to talk more. I adjusted myself piece by piece, like sanding down rough edges, so I would fit better into whatever shape someone else needed. For years, I believed that was what grown men did. They compromised. They supported. They kept the peace. If something bothered me, I swallowed it. If I felt overlooked, I told myself I was overreacting. If I was tired, I pushed through. There was no single dramatic moment where everything cracked. No explosion. No shouting match. Just a series of quiet decisions where I stepped aside. The strangest part is that people liked me. At work, I was dependable. In my family, I was the responsible son. In relationships, I was attentive. But somewhere under all of that, something was eroding. I remember one night in my late 20s, sitting alone in my apartment after another 14-hour workday. The city outside my window hummed with traffic and distant sirens. My phone buzzed with a message from my manager asking if I could come in early the next morning. I typed back, "Of course." Then I set the phone down and stared at the wall. A question surfaced that I quickly tried to ignore. If you stopped saying yes, what would happen? I did not answer it. I pushed it away like I always did. But that question did not disappear. It waited. And I had no idea that over the next few years, through small moments and quiet realizations, I would start asking it more often. Until one day, someone would try to push me the way they always had. And for the first time in my life, I would not move. By the time I hit 31, I had built a life that looked solid from the outside. Good job. Clean apartment. Long-term relationship. My parents were proud. My boss trusted me. Friends called me dependable. If you had asked me whether I was happy, I would have said yes without hesitation. But I had learned something about myself by then. Just because I answered quickly did not mean the answer was true. At work, I had become the guy management relied on. My boss, Paul, called me into his office one Friday afternoon and explained that the company was restructuring. Layoffs were coming. He needed someone stable to absorb 2 extra departments temporarily. Longer hours, more stress, no clear end date. I nodded before he finished talking. There was a moment, small but real, when I thought about asking questions. About compensation. About whether it was sustainable. About whether I even wanted that kind of pressure. Instead, I thanked him for trusting me. That weekend I canceled plans. The next week I was at the office before sunrise and leaving long after dark. My phone buzzed constantly. I told myself it was ambition. That this was how you moved up. Claire started noticing the shift. She would sit across from me at dinner while I scrolled through emails. One night, she told me she felt like she was competing with my job. I felt immediate guilt. So I promised I would set boundaries. But when Paul called at 9 at night, I answered. When he asked me to come in on Sunday, I went. Around that same time, Claire brought up moving out of state for her career. It was a real opportunity for her. A big one. I did not hesitate. I told her I would go, that I could find work anywhere, that I supported her. She did not ask what I wanted. She assumed I would adjust. And she was right. The strange part is, I did not feel angry. I felt exposed. Because I realized I had trained everyone in my life to expect flexibility from me. I had built an identity around being the reasonable one. A week later, at a family dinner, my mother casually suggested I move closer to home when she and my father retired. She framed it as practical, sensible, good for the family. I opened my mouth to agree, and then I paused. Just for a second. The silence stretched longer than it should have. My mother looked at me, waiting. My father shifted in his seat. For the first time in my life, I did not immediately say yes. I ended up giving a vague answer. Something safe. But that hesitation stayed with me. It was small, almost invisible. Still, it was the first crack in the version of me everyone thought they knew. And I had no idea how much that crack was about to widen. The real shift did not happen all at once. It came in pieces, and I almost missed it. A month after that dinner with my parents, Claire got the offer out of state. It was a major promotion. Bigger salary. More visibility. She was glowing when she told me, pacing around the living room with excitement. I remember watching her, feeling proud of her. And then she said something that stuck with me. She said, I already told them we would relocate by the end of the summer. Not if, not what do you think? Just we would. It was subtle. No malice in her voice. No manipulation. Just certainty. The old version of me would have smiled and started updating my resume that night. I would have framed it as being supportive, as being a good partner. Instead, I felt that pause again. I asked her how long she had known. She said a couple of weeks. She wanted to be sure before telling me. That answer should not have bothered me as much as it did. But something about it felt off. Like a decision had been forming around me, not with me. I told her I needed time to think. The words felt foreign in my mouth. She blinked at me, confused. I had never asked for time before. I had never hesitated. What is there to think about? She asked. I did not have a clean answer. That was the problem. I was not sure if I did not want to move, or if I was just tired of automatically agreeing. At work, the pressure was building too. Paul had started treating my availability as a given. Emails marked urgent at midnight. Meetings scheduled without checking my calendar. Tasks added to my plate without conversation. One afternoon, he handed me another project. I was already overloaded. Something in me tightened. I heard myself say, calmly, that I could not take it on without dropping something else. The silence that followed was thick. Paul looked at me like I had spoken in a different language. You have always handled more than this, he said. I almost folded right there. Almost apologized. Instead, I repeated that my bandwidth was full. He did not argue. He just nodded slowly, like he was reassessing me. That look stayed with me longer than I expected. The next few days felt different. Slightly colder. Slightly more distant. As if I had stepped out of an unspoken agreement. At home, Claire was more restless. She started making comments about ambition. About how she did not want to stagnate. I started noticing a pattern I had ignored for years. The people around me were comfortable as long as I stayed predictable, flexible, available, adjustable. The moment I introduced uncertainty, the atmosphere changed. That realization was not empowering. It was unsettling, because it meant that much of the stability I thought I had was built on one thing, my willingness to bend. And I could feel, slowly but clearly, that I was reaching the point where bending was starting to feel like breaking. Claire and I did not break up in a dramatic way. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, just a quiet conversation that felt like it had been building for months. A week after I told her I needed time to think about relocating, she sat across from me at our kitchen table. Her posture was straight, controlled, calm in a way that made me uneasy. She said she could not wait forever for me to decide what I wanted. That sentence hit harder than I expected, not because it was unfair, but because I realized I had no clear answer to give her. She said she needed a partner who was decisive, someone who matched her momentum, someone who was certain. I almost said I could be that person. The words formed automatically in my throat, but something stopped them. For the first time, I did not promise to become whatever was required to keep someone from leaving. Instead, I told her I was not sure. Not sure about moving. Not sure about my job. Not sure about who I had been trying to be. She looked at me like I had become a stranger. A week later, she accepted the job and left. Just like that, the future I had been quietly adjusting myself around disappeared. I expected to feel panic or regret. Instead, I felt something unfamiliar. Space. The apartment was quieter. My schedule was still packed, but the pressure at home was gone. There was no one asking where I saw myself in 5 years. No one assuming I would relocate without question. At work, though, the pressure intensified. Paul started delegating more aggressively. I noticed that tasks other managers pushed back on somehow ended up on my desk. One afternoon, I overheard him in a meeting say, "Give it to Daniel. He will handle it." There was no discussion about whether I should. Just certainty. That was the moment the pattern became impossible to ignore. At home, I adjusted to keep Claire comfortable. At work, I adjusted to keep Paul satisfied. With my parents, I adjusted to keep harmony intact. Different environments. Same role. The one who absorbs. The one who smooths. The one who says yes. I started replaying moments from the past few years in my head. Times I stayed silent when I disagreed. Times I worked through exhaustion because I did not want to disappoint anyone. Times I agreed to plans that did not sit right with me. I had always framed it as maturity. But maturity should not feel like erasure. One Friday evening, Paul called me into his office again. Another temporary expansion of responsibilities. Another urgent initiative that needed someone steady. I listened quietly. Then I told him I would need a formal title change and compensation adjustment if I was expected to operate at that level permanently. The words came out steady. His expression shifted immediately. He leaned back in his chair and studied me, like he was recalibrating. "That is not how we usually do things," he said. I nodded. I knew that. But I also knew something else. I was not the same person who used to nod and accept everything without question. For the first time, I saw it clearly. People were comfortable with me as long as I stayed manageable. And I was starting to realize that being manageable was not the same thing as being respected. The tension in that room lingered long after I left his office. And I had a feeling it was only the beginning. After I asked for the title change and compensation adjustment, things at work shifted in ways no one openly acknowledged. Paul did not argue with me that day. He just said he would look into it. His tone was polite, professional, but something underneath it had cooled. The following week, I noticed I was no longer automatically included in certain meetings. Conversations that used to involve me were happening without me. I would find out about decisions after they were already made. It was subtle, but it was deliberate. For years, I had believed that working harder guaranteed security, that being agreeable guaranteed trust. Now I was starting to see the trade. As long as I absorbed pressure quietly, I was indispensable. The moment I asked for something in return, I became complicated. At the same time, my parents started calling more frequently. Claire's move had traveled through the family quickly. My mother framed her departure as unfortunate, but avoidable. She hinted that if I had been more decisive, things might have turned out differently. My father asked if I regretted not going with her. The old reflex came back strong. The urge to defend myself. To explain. To smooth the narrative so no one felt uncomfortable. Instead, I said something simple. "I do not know." That answer unsettled them. My mother began offering advice again. Maybe I should consider a more stable path. Maybe I should think about settling down soon. Maybe I needed clearer goals. What she really meant was that uncertainty made her nervous. And I realized something I had never admitted before. Their comfort had always depended on my predictability. Around this time, something unexpected happened at work. One of the departments I had been covering started struggling. Deadlines slipped. Communication broke down. Normally, I would have stayed late, patched the gaps, and quietly fixed it. This time, I did not. I left at a reasonable hour. The next morning, Paul called me in. He pointed out the performance dip. He asked what happened. I told him calmly that the workload required more resources, that I had flagged capacity limits weeks earlier. There was no apology in my voice, just clarity. He stared at me longer than usual. You used to just handle things, he said. That sentence stayed with me. Used to. As if my value had been tied to silent endurance. That evening, sitting alone in my apartment, I felt something shift fully into place. For most of my life, I had equated cooperation with worth. If I was helpful, I was valuable. If I was flexible, I was loved. If I was agreeable, I was safe. But what happens when you remove that pattern? You find out who was there for you, and who was there for what you provided. I did not feel angry. I felt clear. For the first time, I could see how many expectations placed on me were never truly mine. They were inherited, assumed, reinforced, and now that I had started pulling back, people were reacting. Some with confusion, some with frustration, some with distance. I could feel tension building, like something inevitable was approaching. Someone, sooner or later, was going to test me. They were going to assume I would fold the way I always had. And when that moment came, I knew one thing. I would not respond the way the old version of me would have. The defining moment did not arrive with shouting or threats. It came on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Paul called an all-managers meeting. The atmosphere was tight before it even began. Sales numbers were down. Upper leadership was pushing hard. There was talk of restructuring again. Halfway through the meeting, Paul shifted the conversation toward accountability. He pulled up performance charts on the screen. One of the departments I had been temporarily overseeing was highlighted in red. He did not look at me at first. He spoke generally. About ownership. About leadership. About stepping up. Then he said my name. He framed it carefully. Not an accusation. Just a suggestion that perhaps I had not leaned in the way I usually did. The old version of me would have taken that on immediately. I would have apologized publicly. Promised to fix it. Offered to stay late. To rework strategy. To personally ensure improvement. Instead, I stayed still. I waited until he finished. Then I calmly reminded the room that I had raised capacity concerns weeks earlier, that I had requested additional staff support, that I had clarified the temporary nature of my oversight role. I kept my tone even. No defensiveness, no aggression, just facts. The room was quiet. Paul tried to redirect, saying leaders adapt regardless of resources. That was when I said something that surprised even me. I am willing to lead, I said, but not to absorb structural problems without authority or support. You could feel the shift in the room. Not explosive, just sharp. For the first time, I was not cushioning the impact for anyone else. I was not volunteering to carry what was not mine. Paul's expression tightened. He was not used to resistance from me. From others, yes, but not from me. The meeting moved on, but the tone had changed. Afterward, one of the other managers pulled me aside. He told me quietly that he had been thinking the same things for months, but never said them. That comment stuck with me. I had spent years believing that speaking up would isolate me. Instead, it clarified things. That afternoon, Paul called me into his office again. He asked if something had changed. I could have given him a safe answer. Stress, personal life, burnout. Instead, I told him I was no longer willing to operate without defined scope or recognition. He studied me carefully. You are different lately, he said. He did not say it like a compliment. Driving home that night, I realized something important. The fear I used to feel around conflict was fading. Not because I enjoyed confrontation, but because I finally understood that avoiding it had cost me more. For years, I thought keeping peace made me strong. Now I was starting to see that clarity required tension. And the strange part? I did not feel rebellious. I felt steady. Someone had tried to pressure me the way they always had, and it had not worked. That realization was quiet, but it was permanent. After that meeting, I assumed things would either escalate or settle. Instead, they shifted sideways. Paul became more formal with me. Emails were shorter. Conversations were strictly transactional. There was no more casual praise about being dependable. No more comments about me being the backbone of the team. At first, I felt the pull to fix that, to soften things, to reassure him that I was still loyal. But I did not. I did my work. I stayed within the scope we had clarified. I left on time most evenings. And for the first time in years, I did not feel guilty walking out of the office while lights were still on behind me. At home, the changes continued too. My mother invited me to dinner one Sunday. I could tell from her tone that she had an agenda. When I arrived, she and my father were already seated at the table, waiting. Halfway through the meal, she brought up my future again. She said I seemed distant lately, less communicative, less certain. She asked if I was going through something. I told her I was thinking more carefully about decisions. She frowned slightly. She said she hoped I was not becoming stubborn. That word caught my attention. Stubborn. For years, when Emily pushed back, my mother called her strong-willed. When I pushed back, it was stubborn. I asked her calmly what she meant. She hesitated, then said she was worried I was closing myself off from advice. Advice. I realized then that much of what I had called guidance in my life had actually been direction. Subtle pressure disguised as care. I told her I appreciated their input, but I needed to make decisions that felt right to me. My father stayed quiet for most of it. But before I left, he said something that surprised me. He said, "You used to be easier. Not kinder. Not happier. Easier." That sentence followed me all the way home. It echoed the comment Paul had made. The one about how I used to just handle things. Different settings. Same theme. I had been manageable, predictable, convenient. And now I was not. The strangest part was how calm I felt. There was tension around me, yes. A slight distance in certain conversations. A carefulness in tone from people who used to assume my agreement. But inside, I did not feel chaotic. I felt aligned. For the first time, my responses were not about avoiding discomfort. They were about being accurate. That does not mean I felt fearless. There were moments late at night when I wondered if I was isolating myself. If maybe I had mistaken cooperation for weakness. If perhaps I was overcorrecting. But every time I thought about going back to the old pattern, I felt a tightness in my chest. And that told me everything. The real test, though, had not come yet. Because someone close to me was about to try to pressure me the way they always had. And they were about to discover that the version of me they relied on no longer existed. The real test came from someone I had not expected. Emily. My sister and I had always had an unspoken dynamic. She was the outspoken one, the emotional one. I was the steady one, the problem solver. When she called me one evening, her voice was tight, controlled, but just barely. She and her husband were having financial trouble. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to cause strain. A business idea he had invested in had stalled. Cash flow was tight. She did not ask directly at first. She explained the situation, the stress, the timing, how hard it had been. I listened. Then came the familiar turn. She said she knew I had savings, that I had always been good with money, that I had helped before, back when they needed it for the down payment on their house. She said she hated asking, but she was asking. The old reflex surged through me immediately. I could almost feel the automatic yes forming, the identity I had worn for decades tightening around me. Reliable brother. Steady support. No drama. I asked her how much they needed. She told me. It was not small. In the past, I would have agreed without much discussion. Told myself it was temporary. That family helps family. Instead, I asked about their plan. What adjustments had they made? What expenses were being cut? What timeline were they working with? There was a pause on the other end of the phone. She sounded surprised, then slightly defensive. She said she thought I trusted her. That word again. Trust. As if asking questions meant withholding loyalty. I told her calmly that I did trust her. But I was not comfortable stepping in without clarity. The silence stretched longer than usual. Finally, she said something that made everything clear. She said, "You have always helped before. Not can you help? Not is this okay for you?" Just a reminder of the pattern. And there it was. She was not asking the man I am now. She was asking the man I used to be. For a brief second, I imagined giving in. Restoring the old balance. Easing the tension instantly. Instead, I told her I could not commit to that amount. I offered something smaller. Structured. Defined. Not open-ended. Her tone changed. Cooler. She said she needed time to think. We ended the call politely. But the warmth had shifted. After I hung up, I sat in silence for a long time. I felt guilt. Of course I did. Years of conditioning do not disappear overnight. But beneath the guilt, there was something stronger. Clarity. For the first time, I had not stepped into the role automatically assigned to me. I had not allowed urgency to override alignment. Later that week, Emily texted me a short message. She said they would figure it out. There was distance in her words. But there was also something else. Respect. It was subtle, not dramatic, but it was there. And that was when I understood something fully. Independence does not mean cutting people off. It means your decisions are not extracted from you. They are chosen. And for the first time in my life, I was choosing. The final test came from the place I had expected it all along. Work. A few weeks after my conversation with Emily, upper leadership announced a major shift. Another restructuring. Departments merging. Roles changing. Paul called me into his office late on a Thursday. His tone was measured, controlled, almost friendly again. He explained that with the restructuring, there would be an opportunity for me to step up. It sounded familiar. Expanded oversight. Increased pressure. Undefined timeline. I listened carefully. Then he added the part that mattered. The role would not come with an official promotion yet. That would be evaluated later. For now, it required trust, flexibility, leadership. He leaned back in his chair and said something that told me everything. You have always been someone we can rely on to do what needs to be done. There it was. The same mechanism. The same expectation. The version of me who would absorb first and negotiate later. For a moment, I felt the old pull. The desire to prove myself. To maintain standing. To avoid friction. Then I noticed something else. I was calm. Not defiant. Not emotional. Just clear. I asked him directly what the formal title would be. What the compensation adjustment looked like. What the defined scope included. His expression shifted slightly. Not irritation exactly. More like surprise. He said those details would come in time. That this was about demonstrating commitment. I held his gaze. I am committed to my role, I said. But I am not willing to operate beyond it without alignment. The silence in that office felt different than previous ones. He tried again. He reminded me that this kind of opportunity could shape my future at the company. And that was when I understood something fully. My future could not be built on indefinite promises. For years, that kind of pressure would have worked on me. The suggestion that my value depended on how much I carried without question. This time, it did not. I told him I was open to growth, but not to undefined sacrifice. He nodded slowly. There was no anger, no argument, just recalculation. When I left that office, I realized something quietly powerful. The person who walked out was not the same man who would have walked in a few years earlier. He would have agreed immediately, felt proud of the trust, ignored the imbalance. I felt none of that. I felt steady. Later that evening, sitting in my apartment, I thought about the tie I used to wear because my mother liked it. The city I almost moved to without hesitation. The money I would have transferred without discussion. The projects I would have absorbed without question. None of those decisions had been dramatic. They had just been automatic. And now they were not. Independence did not arrive with rebellion. I did not quit my job. I did not cut off my family. I did not isolate myself from the world. I simply stopped needing permission to think. Stopped equating harmony with self-erasure. Stopped mistaking compliance for character. The strange thing is, the world did not collapse. Some relationships shifted. Some dynamics cooled. Some expectations adjusted. But I remained. And for the first time in my life, I felt something I had never quite felt before. I was no longer someone people could quietly shape to fit their comfort. Not because I was loud. Not because I was defiant. But because I had learned the difference between cooperation and control. And once you see that difference clearly, no one can bend you the same way again. The final realization did not come in a boardroom. It came on a quiet Sunday morning. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, sunlight cutting across the floor, the city still half asleep. No emails. No expectations pressing on me in that moment. Just stillness. For most of my life, I thought independence would feel dramatic. Loud. Like walking away from everything and starting over. Instead, it felt quiet. Over the next few weeks after my conversation with Paul, the restructuring moved forward. I was offered a revised role. Clear scope. Defined authority. Fair compensation. Not because I demanded it angrily, but because I stopped volunteering for less. Emily adjusted too. Our conversations became more balanced. She no longer assumed I would step in automatically. And interestingly, our relationship felt more adult afterward. Less dependent. More mutual. Even my parents softened over time. The first few dinners were tense. My pauses still made my mother uneasy. But eventually, something shifted. When I said I needed time to think about a decision, they stopped pushing as quickly. Not completely, but noticeably. It was as if they were recalibrating to a new version of me. And here's what surprised me most. The world did not punish me for becoming harder to control. It simply adjusted. There were uncomfortable moments, yes. Conversations that ended more abruptly than before. People who needed time to understand that my agreement was no longer automatic. But I did not feel isolated. I felt grounded. One evening, I caught my reflection in the mirror while getting ready for work. I reached for that old navy blue tie out of habit. Then I stopped. I put it back. Not because it was a big statement. Not because anyone would notice. But because I finally understood something simple. Maturity is not about keeping everyone comfortable. It is about being clear about where you stand. For years, I confused flexibility with virtue. I thought absorbing pressure made me strong. I thought avoiding conflict made me wise. In reality, it made me predictable, and predictability made me manageable. Now, when someone asks something of me, I pause. Not out of defiance, but out of respect for my own perspective. Sometimes I say yes. Sometimes I say no. The difference is that the answer is chosen. There is no anger in that. No rebellion. No desire to dominate or withdraw. Just alignment. The man I used to be would have filled silence quickly. He would have reassured everyone. He would have adjusted himself to keep the air light. The man I am now lets silence sit if it needs to. He thinks. He decides. And he does not need permission to do either. That is what independence turned out to be. Not a battle. Not a break. Just the quiet understanding that no one else gets to define the shape of my life unless I hand them the pen. And I no longer do.